Most people think that when someone cuts everyone off, it's because they're cold, bitter, or emotionally detached, that they woke up one day and decided the world wasn't worth the effort. But that's almost never how it happens. It usually starts much quieter than that. It starts with unanswered messages that didn't hurt at first, with conversations that felt slightly heavier than they used to, with a strange realization that being around people now feels more exhausting than being alone. And the moment no one else notices that shift, something changes. Here's the part most people don't talk about. People who cut everyone off rarely do it out of anger. They do it out of exhaustion. Not the kind of exhaustion that sleep fixes, the kind that settles into your chest after years of explaining yourself, adjusting yourself, shrinking yourself, and still feeling misunderstood. Psychologists sometimes describe this as emotional withdrawal, but that term feels too clean for what it actually is. Because for the person going through it, it doesn't feel like withdrawal. It feels like self-preservation. At first, they don't plan to disappear. They just respond a little slower. They cancel plans more often. They tell themselves they're just busy or just tired. And that's true. They are tired, but not of people. They're tired of versions of themselves they had to perform to be accepted. There's a quiet moment that becomes a turning point. It usually happens alone, late at night, when they realize that the calm they feel in solitude is deeper than any comfort they feel in company. That moment is dangerous, not because it's wrong, but because it's convincing. The brain notices patterns quickly, and when it realizes that silence feels safer than conversation, it starts reinforcing that choice. Neuroscience tells us that the brain is constantly scanning for threat and relief. If social interaction has repeatedly been associated with tension, disappointment, or emotional labor, the brain learns to avoid it, even if the threat is subtle. This is why people who cut everyone off don't feel lonely right away. They feel relief from expectations, relief from having to explain their moods, relief from being the listener, the fixer, the understanding one. And here's where the misunderstanding begins. From the outside, it looks like distance. From the inside, it feels like finally being able to breathe. But the story doesn't end there, because the same mechanism that creates relief can slowly build isolation. One of the most overlooked psychological traits of people who cut everyone off is heightened emotional awareness. These are often people who feel deeply, even if they don't show it. They notice tone shifts. They remember things others forget. They absorb emotional undercurrents without realizing how much it costs them. Over time, this creates a quiet imbalance. They give more understanding than they receive. They adapt more than others adjust for them, and eventually the math stops working. Research in emotional labor shows that constantly regulating your emotions for the comfort of others leads to burnout, not just professionally, but socially. When someone feels like every interaction requires effort, masking, or self-editing, their nervous system never fully relaxes. So they pull back, not dramatically, not with a speech, but with distance. And distance, when it finally brings peace, feels addictive. There's another layer people rarely talk about. Many who cut everyone off grew up learning that connection came with conditions. Affection was earned. Approval was inconsistent. Safety depended on reading the room correctly. Psychology refers to this as adaptive behavior. You learn to be who you need to be to keep the connection. But adaptation has a cost. As adults, these individuals often struggle to feel authentic in relationships. They don't trust that they can simply exist without adjusting themselves. So being alone feels honest. When they're by themselves, there's no performance, no emotional monitoring, no need to anticipate reactions, just stillness. And stillness feels like freedom. But here's the quiet paradox. The same people who cut everyone off often crave depth more than anyone else. They don't want less connection. They want real connection. Shallow conversations drain them. Surface-level bonds feel hollow. They don't want to be known by many. They want to be understood by one. And when that understanding doesn't appear, solitude becomes the safer option. Psychologists call this selective withdrawal. It's not about avoiding people. It's about avoiding disappointment. Because disappointment, when repeated enough times, doesn't hurt loudly. It numbs. Another thing that rarely gets mentioned is control. When someone has felt emotionally overwhelmed for a long time, isolation becomes a form of control. They get to decide when they engage, how much they give, when they retreat. And for someone whose emotional boundaries were ignored in the past, that control feels stabilizing. There's a subtle shift that happens here. At first, cutting people off feels temporary, a reset, a break. But over time, the nervous system adapts to the quiet. Silence becomes familiar. Familiar becomes comfortable. Comfort becomes preferred. And that's when reconnecting starts to feel harder than staying alone. This isn't because they've lost social skills. It's because their tolerance for emotional noise has dropped. The brain rewires itself based on repeated experiences. Less stimulation leads to a lower threshold for overwhelm. So even healthy interaction can feel intense after long isolation. This creates an internal conflict. They want connection, but they also fear the emotional cost. So they stay in between, watching life from a distance, present but not involved. People often assume that those who cut everyone off are avoiding accountability or responsibility. But more often, they are avoiding emotional chaos. They've learned that peace is fragile, and they protect it fiercely. There's also grief involved, even if they don't label it that way. Grief for friendships that didn't deepen. Grief for conversations that never felt safe. Grief for being misunderstood without anyone asking why. That grief doesn't always show up as sadness. Sometimes it shows up as indifference, and indifference is easier to carry. Another psychological factor at play is identity. When you step away from everyone, you're forced to sit with yourself, without mirrors, without feedback. At first, that can feel grounding, but it also brings unanswered questions. Who am I when no one is watching? What do I want when no one expects anything from me? For some, this period becomes transformative. For others, it becomes a quiet loop they don't know how to exit. Because reintegrating means risking disappointment again. It means hoping. And hope, when you've been let down enough times, feels risky. There's an unspoken fear beneath all of this. Not of people, but of being unseen while surrounded by them. That kind of loneliness hurts more than physical solitude. So people who cut everyone off choose the pain they can control. Here's something important. This pattern doesn't mean something is wrong with them. It means something overwhelmed them. It means their system adapted to survive. And adaptations are not flaws, they're responses. But every response has a cost. The longer someone stays isolated, the harder it becomes to tell the difference between peace and avoidance. And that's where the real question begins. Not, why did they cut everyone off? But, what would make them feel safe enough to let someone in again? Because deep down, almost none of them want to be alone forever. They just don't want to disappear inside relationships anymore. And that question, what safety actually feels like, is where this story continues. When the silence settles in, something unexpected happens. The world doesn't get quieter, the mind does. And for a while, that feels like relief. People who cut everyone off often describe this phase as clarity. They think more clearly. They notice their own thoughts again. They feel less reactive, less pulled in different emotional directions. Psychologically, this makes sense. When external emotional input decreases, the nervous system finally downshifts. Stress hormones drop. Mental bandwidth returns. This is why isolation can feel healing at first. But the mind is not designed to stay in isolation forever. Human psychology is built around mirrors. We understand ourselves through reflection, through shared experience, disagreement, validation, even friction. When those mirrors disappear, something subtle begins to shift. At first, the person feels self-contained, then self-reliant, then self-enclosed. And that transition happens so slowly that most people don't notice it. One of the most common psychological patterns that emerges here is internalization. Without outside perspectives, thoughts loop inward. Questions go unanswered. Doubts don't get tested against reality. The mind becomes both narrator and audience. This is where people start mistaking isolation for identity. They don't just feel peaceful alone. They start believing they are meant to be alone. That belief feels comforting until it doesn't. Because beneath that comfort, there's often a quiet tension. A sense of being paused while life continues elsewhere. Another layer begins to form. Emotional narrowing. When someone cuts off consistent social interaction, their emotional range can subtly shrink. Not in intensity, but in flexibility. They still feel deeply, but fewer things trigger those feelings. Joy becomes quieter. Excitement becomes rare. Connection feels abstract, like a concept instead of an experience. Psychologists refer to this as affect constriction. It's not numbness, it's containment. And containment feels safe until it starts to feel small. Here's something important most people miss. Many who cut everyone off are not avoiding people. They are avoiding emotional unpredictability. They want connection that feels stable, calm, and mutual. Not draining, not chaotic, not one-sided, but the longer they stay disconnected, the more their standards for connection rise, sometimes unrealistically. They don't want small talk. They don't want casual check-ins. They want depth, understanding, resonance. And while that desire is valid, it creates a paradox. Depth usually requires time. Time requires consistency. Consistency requires showing up imperfectly. But when someone has been hurt by inconsistency before, they hesitate to invest again. So they wait. They tell themselves they're being selective, that they're protecting their energy, that they'll reconnect when the right person appears. But psychology shows us something uncomfortable. Waiting without engagement slowly turns into avoidance. Not intentional, not conscious, just practiced. Another thing that happens in prolonged isolation is emotional independence turning into emotional self-sufficiency. At first, this feels empowering. They learn to self-soothe. They process emotions alone. They rely on routines, creativity, introspection. But over time, the ability to need others starts to feel foreign. Needing someone feels like weakness. Depending on someone feels risky. And yet, humans are wired for interdependence. The conflict between independence and connection creates quiet internal stress. It shows up as restlessness, as late-night overthinking, as a feeling that something is missing, without knowing what. Here's the part few people talk about honestly. People who cut everyone off often become very good at appearing fine. They function well, they're productive, they don't create problems, and because of that, no one checks in deeply. Their isolation goes unnoticed, not because no one cares, but because they don't seem to need care. This reinforces the belief that being self-contained is the safest way to exist. But safety without warmth eventually feels empty. Another psychological shift occurs around trust. When someone disconnects for long enough, trust stops being about others. It becomes about protecting their inner equilibrium. They start evaluating people not on character, but on how emotionally disruptive they might be. This makes them hyper-aware of tone, energy, and potential conflict. It's not judgment, it's self-defense. But hypervigilance is exhausting. The mind is always scanning, always measuring, always deciding whether engagement is worth the cost. And eventually, the cost feels too high. So they remain distant, even from people who mean well. There's also a quiet grief that resurfaces here. Not the grief of loss, but the grief of unrealized connection. Moments that could have become friendships. Conversations that could have gone deeper. People who almost understood them. This grief doesn't cry out. It whispers. It shows up as nostalgia for something that never fully existed. Another subtle effect of cutting everyone off is narrative rigidity. When you spend a lot of time alone, you create stories about yourself. I'm better on my own. People are too much. Connection costs more than it gives. These narratives help make sense of the choice, but over time, they harden. And hardened narratives leave little room for new experiences. The brain prefers coherence over accuracy, so it will protect the story, even if reality changes. That's why re-entry feels scary. Letting someone in doesn't just risk emotional pain. It risks disrupting the identity built around solitude. Who am I if I let someone matter again? That question carries weight, and yet, something inside keeps stirring, because no matter how peaceful isolation feels, it doesn't fully replace being seen. Psychological research consistently shows that meaningful connection is one of the strongest predictors of long-term emotional well-being. Not quantity, quality. Even one safe connection can regulate the nervous system in ways solitude cannot. The people who cut everyone off often know this intellectually, but emotionally it feels unreachable. They don't know how to bridge the gap between self-protection and openness, so they linger in the middle. Not fully alone, not fully connected, watching, thinking, waiting. Here's the quiet truth. Reconnection doesn't happen through forcing social energy. It happens through safety. Safety to speak without editing. Safety to feel without managing others. Safety to exist without explanation. For people who have cut everyone off, trust is rebuilt not through grand gestures, but through consistency. Small moments, predictable presence, emotional steadiness, and sometimes that safety begins internally. By questioning whether isolation is still serving them, by noticing when peace has turned into avoidance, by allowing curiosity about connection again, without pressure. Because cutting everyone off was never about rejecting people. It was about surviving something that felt too heavy at the time. And survival strategies are meant to evolve. The mind is remarkably adaptable. What once protected you may no longer be what you need. And that doesn't mean the choice was wrong. It means you're changing. The psychology of people who cut everyone off is not a story of detachment. It's a story of sensitivity, of boundaries learned through experience, of depth waiting for safety. And maybe the most important realization is this. Wanting peace doesn't mean you're meant to be alone. It means you're meant to be understood, without disappearing. And that possibility, even if it feels distant right now, is still there, quietly waiting, just like you were